Hello, I'm Sarah Akigbogun and welcome to a very special conversation. This year, the PhD programme in architectural design at the Bartlett School of Architecture celebrates its 25th anniversary, marking 25 years since the graduation of Professor Jonathan Hill, the first PhD to graduate from the programme. As part of that, it was my absolute pleasure to speak to Professor Lesley Lokko, who was supervised by Jonathan Hill. Professor Lokko hardly needs any introduction. She is an academic, architect, curator, and novelist, and she was the curator of the groundbreaking 2023 Venice Architecture Biennale. She was the recipient of the 2024 RIBA Gold Medal, only the first woman from the African continent to receive the award in the RIBA's nearly 200-year history. She also leads the African Futures Institute, which she founded in 2021. And we spoke about how her work has moved across continents, disciplines, and roles, and about the joyful approach she takes to the issue of race in the context of architectural design. Firstly, thank you very much for agreeing to this call at kind of relatively short notice. I know you're extremely busy. So firstly to say, I have wanted to speak to you since starting work on the XXAOC project, Female Architects of Colour. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to speak to you through this project. Mm-hmm. And of course, we're celebrating 25 years of the design PhD at the Bartlett, which you are a graduate, and I'm a current PhD. So I should declare an interest. My work also looks at race and space. There's also this layer of gender, but my work has been maybe at this stage a little more caught up with with what I will call, or what you call, the ism of race. Maybe it's becoming a little bit more from that place. So I was really delighted to come across your work and your take on race, which comes from, or at least seeks to explore, a place of delight and joy. Your PhD is called Race, Space and Place. And I wanted to know why you felt it was important to explore those things at that time and within a design PhD.
I came to architecture quite late, so I did done a degree in sociology before I studied architecture. Mm-hmm. And I did my first degree in the US, which meant that when I came to study architecture in the UK, I had to go all the way back to year one. So in the UK, you couldn't go in at the graduate level. You had to start year one. So I'm slightly older. I was, I think, 27 or 28 when I started at the Bartlett, and there were quite a number of what were called mature students at the time. So I think our year had something like 40% mature students.
Okay.
So people who had done a degree before, which was interesting. And in a way, you were encouraged not to leave your previous life behind, that in some way you were supposed to fold it into what you were doing. And I arrived at the Bartlett in 1989, which was the year before Peter Cook took over. So I actually started under the old year system. And I think it was fair to say that there was no way to incorporate any of my previous interests in that structure.
So none of that.
There was very, very little design in that first year. So it was mostly kind of history and theory and structures. It was a very, I would say, uncreative approach. And there was this idea that you had to do the basics before you could start to be creative. So it was quite a stifling environment. But then when the unit system came in I think it was 1990, the pedagogy was sort of broken apart. And we all realized that there was something new happening, even if we were, undergrads and didn't really fully appreciate it. And I found the first 2 years of undergraduate very difficult. They were a real challenge because I felt as if the things that mattered in my environment, questions of identity, of culture, of language, of ritual, of gender, of place, had no place in the Bartlett curriculum at the time. Mm-hmm. And everybody kept saying to me, Or just wait, when you get to diploma, when you get to the master's level, that's when you'll be able to talk about those things. And so the undergraduate experience, was not a great one. Mm. And I think in my final review in year 3, Jonathan Hill walked into the review room and he came over to look at some of my drawings. And I was in Jeremy Till's unit. And Jeremy Till said to me, watch out. If Jonathan Hill gets his claws into you, you'll be sunk.
In what sense did he mean that? I
didn't know what he meant by that. And Jonathan came over and asked me a couple of questions about the drawings, and I could see he was interested. Mm-hmm. So when I went away to South Africa to work in my year out, I went to Peter Cook, who was the head of school, and said, listen, I'm going to go away for a year. I would like to be given a place now, and I would like to defer my place because I don't know that I can come back from South Africa for an interview. Okay. And Peter Cook looked at my portfolio and said, I think verbatim, I can't bear the kind of stuff you do.
No.
Yeah, he was very open about it. Okay. He said, but I think you are an interesting person and I think you will do interesting things. So I'm going to grant you a place now and you can defer it for a year and you can come back.
Did he give you any kind of pointers as to what it was specifically?
No. Okay. And I think that was very much Peter Cook's manner, Right. So it meant that you were slightly bemused by why he might have singled you out. But it also meant that I knew before I left the Bartlett as an undergrad that I would come back into Jonathan Hill's unit because he had been the first person to show interest in my work. So when I came back into diploma, I went straight into Jonathan's unit, and it was really like coming home in a sense. Because although Jonathan was not interested in race or gender or Africa or migration or diaspora or any of the things that I was consumed by, he had a very generous approach to what constituted architecture. And that generosity meant that he had a very open house. You could come to his unit, Unit 12, with literally anything. And it was a very explorative space. And I think through his sort of support, I began over the months to gain more and more confidence to talk about, things like race, but not from the perspective of racism. Mm-hmm. It was much more to try to think about race as a really creative, a very rich category. And I think that intersected very well with the way that he taught. Mm-hmm. And it was an amazing 2 years. And when I finished, he asked me to teach immediately with him. So that's how I started teaching. Yeah.
That's incredible. I mean, firstly, it's amazing to happen upon or to find that kind of relationship at that stage during diploma. And then that sort of generosity, particularly one that allows an exploration of race. It's, because it's very rare. Yeah, one often hears the kind of complete opposite. So that's incredible because then, of course, so that relationship starts and Jonathan Hill goes on to become your supervisor. So that's really exciting. So this idea of race and joy and kind of pivoting into something that is more expansive and creative. You cite Toni Morrison, Playing in the Dark. Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination is Toni Morrison's 1992 piece of literary criticism in which she uses jazz as a metaphor for Black cultural expression that disrupts, ruptures. If you could say a little more about leaning into that.
Yeah, I mean, I came to Toni Morrison as a fiction reader, so I think at the time that I started reading her, I think Sula was her first book, and I must have read that when I was about 17 or 18. I didn't know Blackness could be written in that way, I think was the way I would describe it, that she was describing a world. I mean, I'm not African American, but it was familiar enough to me in some ways to be able to access it. But I had never encountered a Black writer who was so in command of language. So up until that point, most of the Black writers were sort of the Heinemann African Writers series. It was the Chinua Achebes and the Wole Soyinkas and so on, which always seemed to me to be writing from a very self-conscious post-colonial position. And it seemed to me that Morrison just bystepped all of that and wrote about this world in a way that was so sure of itself, so confident, so grounded in its own reality, that I didn't realize when I was reading her at first that I was reading about Blackness. Her command of language was so complete that I just thought I was reading about another world. And I didn't know at that time that writers could also be academics, certainly not fiction writers. So when someone gave me Playing in the Dark, it was the first time I connected her kind of political view to her fiction. I didn't know that writers could do that. And suddenly I began to see her novels in a completely different light, that I saw them as this place of resistance and reclaim and remembering. Whereas previously I had simply enjoyed them for the beauty of their language. And I think it was the first inkling to me that language could have two sides, that it could be seductive and beautiful and joyful, and at the same time be absolutely hard-hitting and political and social. And I think that was the first premonition that architecture could work in the same way. You didn't have to be activist or poetic. You could be activist and poetic, and you could be poetic and activist. I think that was the first overturning of some of the, what you call them, the shibboleths of architecture.
And you also speak of, and maybe this is something we'll circle back to, it's this idea of the space of the imagination and that opening up. Maybe we'll circle back to that idea. I wondered whether you think this idea, coming at race this way, is useful in terms of dismantling or shaking up some of the architectural pedagogies that exist, or some of the hierarchies that we find within those pedagogies. So activism is one thing. So to come at this with activism is one way around, but it strikes me that this idea of using joy is that there's a stealth in that. And I wonder if it's something that's been useful as you've continued in your journey as an academic.
I think so. I mean, I think the idea that protest or refusal, or that somehow that stance can only be articulated in one way. I mean, I always say to my students that, to be angry is only the first step. Maybe the anger is the thing that propels you, but you're going to need a lot more than anger to kind of keep going and to draw sustenance. And I think that when you're in a position of protest, that you want to dismantle something, your burden is always at least triplefold. You have to master the thing that it is you want to dismantle. You have to justify why it is you want to dismantle, and then you have to propose something in its place. And that kind of tripartite way of working, I mean, at an imaginative level is exhausting.
It's heavy.
It's very, very heavy.
Yeah.
And those moments of joy and freedom and imagination, I don't see them as moments of respite. I actually see them as really necessary moments to give you the fuel to continue. Mm-hmm. And part of the challenge, I think, when you deal with race is that you are always locked into a kind of unforgiving binary. Something is or it isn't. It's either black or it's white, or it's either, evil versus good. I mean, there's an incredibly restrictive way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. And that structure, the oppressiveness of that structure, I think it can often destabilize you. I mean, I think I remember Morrison saying, part of the challenge with racism is that it is always a distraction. Whatever you do is never going to be good enough. So if you enter into it thinking about those absolutes, something is good or it's bad, to me it seems very unhelpful. And so I think with Jonathan and with the diploma work and with the teaching, it was always trying to say, look, we've got to get onto a much more even footing where I don't have to justify why I'm doing something. I don't have to explain it. I don't have to seek permission. This work is just what it is. It's the same as if I was doing any other form of work. Beauty and the joy and the kind of lightness and the humor and, the many ways that you can approach this sideways, to me, are really just tactics to deal with something that can be so overwhelming and so oppressive that, eventually most people I know just gave up. Yeah, at the time I was studying and even early teaching, many, many people I knew at that time who were in architecture simply left.
And I was going to say, I think unfortunately that's still a familiar place that people find themselves in, feeling the need to confront these issues because they are a part of people's everyday
experience.
Exactly. And then architecture is what we do, it's what we exist in. And so, people seek ways through that within the profession, within education, and then I think come up against walls, whether it's the kind of just the internal walls or whether it's external, and that is exhausting. So this is a refreshing take. And so there are a couple of things about your PhD. First of all, you go on this search to understand and, let's say, dissect race, and then what you find isn't exactly what you anticipate. So there are some surprises. And then you talk about creative accidents, so turning that discovery into something that then becomes much more playful and fertile and eventually leads you towards building. So can you say something about that? Firstly, I think that moment that you describe of not finding what you anticipated and of kind of having to rethink things is something that will be very familiar to many PhD candidates. You set out to do something, and then in the process of exploration, you find something else, and that is destabilizing. Say something about that experience and how you found your way out of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. One was that at the time I started the PhD, I'd already left architecture, so I'd made the switch into writing fiction. So I was no longer really living, breathing, practicing architecture. So that was the first thing. And there was a kind of liberation in that because it meant that I didn't have to financially support myself in the same way as I would have if I'd been a PhD student. And writing fiction gave me the resources. It gave me the financial resources to buy a piece of land and to build my own house. Like I could never have done that as a PhD student.
Okay, that's fascinating.
So when my first novel started selling well, I thought, well, so much of the criticism in my architectural life has been about the fact that you are not an architect. The stuff you do is not architecture. I mean, if I had $1 for every time someone has asked me, is this architecture? I could have retired 30 years ago. So I thought, well, why don't I do the most architectural thing I can, which is let me build a building. So the initial, when I started the PhD, I was not thinking about writing fiction. I didn't have anything like that in mind. When it became possible, I thought, okay, Jonathan, why don't I build something? And, the easiest thing to do in a sense is to build your own house. You're your own client. So that was an accident, literally an accident that I was able to do that. And Jonathan agreed that perhaps building something physically would be the least expected thing to do in the PhD, because the PhDs at that point were really about speculative design, not really about bricks and mortar. So the excuse to try and build something was very tempting because it had been it was the stick that was always kind of used to beat the question of whether race has anything to do with architecture. And to be honest, the PhD was written very, very quickly.
Okay.
And I think from start to finish, it was about 4 months.
Wow, okay.
It was very, very fast. And one of the things that I realized after having built a building was that building an argument is not so different. You literally, I started with the table of contents. And once I knew what the table of contents was, I could organize that structure in my head. Then it literally simply was a matter of filling in with the blanks. So it was not, in the end, that insurmountable intellectual challenge that I thought it was going to be. It was actually fairly pragmatic. And I approached it the same way I approached fiction writing, which was like, I have a rough template of what I want to do, study the prototypes, put the structure in place, and then just build it. And I would say that that's how the PhD happened. I mean, things that have happened subsequently have not been so clear cut, but that was really the way I approached it, because otherwise, I think that task of having to explain, justify, dismantle, rebuild would have finished me off.
Fascinating. So many things to unpack there. So firstly, this idea of having stepped away from architecture, and I'd like to talk to you more about that. But this idea of being a woman of resources, time you start your PhD. And I noticed that in your writing, actually, this is a kind of woman that you write quite a lot. I mean, I'm interested in that. In your writing, we encounter lots of powerful women who are able who have a sense of agency. So I'm really interested in that. And then also this kind of reciprocity between building and writing, and the idea brought something from the process back. So these are all interesting things. I wondered, firstly, at the kind of prosaic level, why it was important to you to build in Africa. Was it just that was where you could build, or was there something about building in that place?
I mean, it's home. I grew up in Ghana. So for me, there was never a question that I wouldn't come home.
Yes.
And like many people, I left Ghana when I was nearly 18, went to boarding school, then went to university, then traveled around a bit and then came back. And having the resources to come back as an adult, I came back in a very different way. So I arrived back, I think, in 2002 in Ghana. And in those days, I'd been away for nearly 20 years. So to come back into my father's house, my father was still here, that was difficult. I came back as an adult. And I didn't come back into a job. I think if I'd come into a job in Ghana, I probably would have packed up and gone home, gone back to Britain, But I came back with agency. So it allowed me to come home in a different way. And because the PhD and kind of all of my work had to do with race, I wanted to go to the place where race wasn't a construct. So in a strange way, the only way I understood race in Ghana growing up was that here I'm considered white. So, and it's less a color statement than it is a class statement. And
in Ghana?
In Ghana, yes. And I'm of the generation of men who left Ghana in the 1950s and 1960s, who were sent overseas by Nkrumah, invariably married European women and then came back. So the accusation that we were European culturally was actually quite correct, because many of the men came back with European wives and lived in ways that were very, very different to the ways that they grew up. So my understanding of race in Ghana was almost the opposite to what it was in the UK. And I often say that, I left British Caledonia when I was 17 and a half. And when I left Accra, I was half Scottish, half Ghanaian. That's how I would have articulated myself. And when I arrived at Gatwick the next morning, I was black. And it's not that I didn't know what black was, but it would not have been the lens, the primary lens. For me, the primary lens was always place. I'm Ghanaian. So that was a bit of a wake-up call. And I wanted to go back to the place where it didn't work in that way, to somehow test its importance. Yeah.
No, I understand that there's so many things about that I understand. So firstly, I was born here, British, but my father was of that generation that was sent here to school, also boarding school. And so, and he is funnily enough, he has currently gone back home and is in the midst of a building project. And that's something I feel as though it's been his lifelong ambition to do that.
Yeah.
And so I understand this call, but also the sense of Africa as home, that need to build. But I was intrigued by a comment that you made, which is that, so unlike me, you were born in Africa. And so traveling back is not less complicated, but there was a sense of returning. But I can relate to this idea of becoming conscious of race when you move between these worlds. So I will never forget visiting Nigeria for the first time when I was about 12 and being like, oh my goodness, like I'm just like everyone else. I don't see this. And then returning and suddenly being Black.
Well, and it's almost primal. So for me, my earliest memories of people are Ghanaians. Like I don't have any memory beyond that. So even though I'm comfortable in the UK in certain places, it will always be foreign to me at a very primal level. Yeah.
Whereas I'm much more confused. So maybe, and this is something I kind of noted with some of your characters. I've just read Soul Sisters, and this idea of this. No, but the idea of because obviously that's moving backwards and forwards between the UK and South Africa, and you play with this idea of home, the slipperiness. I'm going to call it the slipperiness of home.
But I think you alluded to it when you talk about becoming. And, the idea that one is always, Stuart Hall says this, you're always in the process of becoming. And I think majority cultures, like in the UK, like in the United States, certain parts of Europe, it's a kind of a myth that there is anything like a fixed identity. It's a fiction. So if anything, the PhD and then teaching and, even moving to places like South Africa taught me over the last, 20, 30 years is that to be comfortable in the becoming, to be comfortable in the slipperiness, it's a corny way to say it, but that is the superpower. And an architecture initially doesn't have a huge amount of use for that because its psyche is always the opposite. It's to fix, not to slip. But I think increasingly we're beginning to understand that, architecture stability is also a fiction.
Yes, you talk about that, this idea that architecture maybe needs to be less about building and less about permanence and more expansive. But something that you just said there perhaps answers or begins to answer something I wanted to ask you next, which is why you moved away from architecture, or rather towards writing. What you get from the space of writing, you don't get from architecture, and then maybe what you can bring back to architecture from writing.
I think that the divisions, the sort of disciplinary divisions, when I was just graduating, were much more rigid than they are today. I think that there's a kind of porosity and a sort of generosity about interdisciplinary approaches to things that people are slowly coming to understand. So at the time, for me, it felt like an exit from architecture to go to something else. But over time, I think I've come to see them as two sides of the same coin. Like I don't see such a huge distinction between writing and building. And it's not that I think architecture needs to become more open. I think it's that architecture needs to become more questioning, because I think that the building, the permanence, the stability is the sign. It's not the thing. It's the thing that the discipline wishes to project to cover up its own vulnerability. And where race and gender and identity really disrupt it is because they are, by their very nature, unstable constructs. It doesn't mean that they're weak or that they are vulnerable. If anything, I think they're the opposite. And architecture's inability to embrace that vulnerability is its Achilles heel. So I think after, 30 odd years, I've come to see it almost in reverse, that the issue was not that the trope of race had nothing to give architecture. I think I've come to understand that architecture has nothing to give the trope of race. And that's to do with architecture's own vulnerability, not race's instability. I think race, to my mind now, is the greatest gift to architecture, whereas 30 years ago, it was described as the thing that would end it. I think it's the thing that will begin it, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
No, it does. I mean, we could say it gives it a place to go, maybe.
Yeah, it gives it a place in the world, yeah. And it gives it meaning, it gives it purpose. I mean, when you think now about, all of the, it started off with political instability, but, we're talking about environmental, we're talking about racial, we're talking about digital. I mean, there's a whole, the nature of the world right now is unstable. But, as people of color, instability has been our DNA for so long. We know this space. Yeah,
sure.
That's how
we have these means of adapting, and also of creating out of that.
And all of those things, yeah.
This is something I've not really thought about, the idea that our existence, our history, in some ways equips us very well for that space.
Questions of sort of, the way racism is positioned as, social justice. I mean, I've got nothing against those tropes. But for me, they're too limiting. To me, it's simply part of the tradition that Black people are called upon to fix something that was never of their making. So I see it as part of the trajectory of extraction and exploitation. So I would insist on imagination and joy and beauty and ambition and creativity as being really political tools, because otherwise those 1,000 years of experience simply become the Band-Aid for somebody else's wound.
Wow. And to that note, you talk about jazz as space of rupture that we might learn from. And it struck me that the Biennale that you have just created was a kind of rupture. It was seeking to be or facilitate that kind of rupture. And you ask this question about what it is to be an agent of change. And so I wonder how you've just talked about the complexity of this moment. You've talked about the instability that we exist in, political, climate and so on. And also when you started your PhD, it was in a kind of, it was in a pre-George Floyd moment, pre-2 moment. And now we are post. I wonder what you think the future at this time, how we can continue to facilitate that rupture within, say, maybe a time of constriction, a time when that feels difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have an easy answer for that. My overriding memory of the Biennale, apart from the amount of work it was a horrendous amount of work. And also a horrendous amount of work for someone in my position. I think the Architecture Biennale is predicated on the model of an art biennale. But in the art biennale, the work that you exhibit already exists. It's either in a collection or it's in a museum or the artist has it. In the Architecture Biennale, you have to make the work in order to show something that exists somewhere else. So the amount of fundraising I had to do in order to facilitate the Biennale was shocking. But my overriding memory of particularly the first, the vernissage and the opening was one of joy. Like if you ask me, what did I take away from that? It was walking up and down the Grand Canal. I don't think Venice had ever seen that number of Black people come through its airports ever.
It was incredible.
And there was at least the way I experienced it, there was a kind of collective joy. That's how I remember it.
There was.
And I think that had to do with community, being in community with one another. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, and this is the part where it's quite hard to be optimistic about the future on the continent, is that the opportunities for us to be together in community are declining. The only way I meet, my peers is generally at some event somewhere in the global north. So part of the commitment to coming back to Ghana to set up the African Futures Institute, to do the Nomadic African Studio, is to make those possibilities of community possible here. And more than the learning and the teaching and the dialoguing and all of the stuff that you do, it is being in the physical presence of one another that I think is the fuel for the future. Mm-hmm. So in that respect, I think the diaspora, people like yourselves, people who came to Venice because they're the ones who can get visas to go, they have a hugely important role to play in fostering that sense of community.
You're certainly right about that sense of joy. I feel as though kind of every Black architect that I knew is at that one moment. It was the most incredible thing. So it's exciting to hear you talk about the African Futures Institute and to understand this idea of community. And I feel as though you're also expanding with the African Futures Institute, also expanding the idea of architectural pedagogy. There's a lot of exploration. So to begin to finish off, I wonder if you could just say a bit more about that vision, about where you're hoping to take that.
Yeah, I mean, I started it, as you know, quite late in life. I think if I'd started the AFI 20 years ago, I mean, it would become a different thing. But when you start something in your 60s,
I don't think this is late.
But if you start something in your 60s, you have a different kind of time frame. So I'm less preoccupied with questions of succession, which is usually what happens when you start something much earlier. You sort of think about its long-term longevity. And especially when you're fundraising for something, the one question my donors have over and over again is, if you are the AFI and you go under a bus, what happens? And so having to wean them away from thinking only in terms of an institute is successful if it lasts for 25 or 30 or 50 years, what I'm trying to say is let it burn really brightly for 5 years. Let us leave behind a really robust archive of how we did this, and let it be a model that if somebody in 7 years' time in Kinshasa gets up and says, look, I think this is a good idea, at least there's a prototype that existed and it will change. So I'm much less tied to the idea of an institute like an academic institute that lives on and on and on, and much more of a kind of a meteor, something that burns really brightly for a time, is inspiring in some ways, but doesn't eventually get bogged down by the weight of institution building. And a lot of people have said to me, well, that's a bit of a cop-out, and I agree. But I don't think that something is successful only in terms of how long it lasts. I'm more towards the idea, how bright did it burn for the time that it was around? So that's sort of where I'm trying to push the AFI.
Okay, understood. So how brightly does it burn, and what's its influence? And
then I think influence in the end is so much more powerful than power. Mm-hmm. I think there's a real distinction between them, and a lot of institutes can be very powerful, but you'd really question, what their influence was. I mean, I've been reading the Epstein files coming out, over the last few days, and just been really struck by the spread of this. And it's a really it's a very disturbing example, but that is an example to me of somebody who had almost absolute power and got away with it for so long because he had no influence. It's a funny thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh goodness, and how emblematic of this time. That kind of
that kind of power is.
Insidious power. Is a reminder of what we are pushing against.
Yeah. You mentioned in the beginning, the sales tax. It's really important. I mean, the AFI tries to go under the political radar. I don't take money from anybody in my country. I have no ties to government, nothing. We just do this quietly. Just get it done.
Lots of lessons to take away, I think.
So how far are you in the PhD?
So I've just started my third year, and I'm really interested in writing, in this kind of in-between space and the back and forth, which is partly why I've been really interested in your work, in this kind of reciprocity. But I think I viewed it very much as a piece of activism. And I will be honest in saying that I think initially I found it hard to find the joy. And I think I was coming at it as a response to things like George Floyd, blah, blah, blah.
Floyd, yeah. I think that's in a weird way, that's also the framework that whiteness understands. And that's where, for me, Jonathan was such an interesting figure because, at one level, he was a middle-class white man from Somerset. Like, he should have had no interest in this. And he didn't, He was not interested in race personally, which meant it was very freeing.
But yeah, it's been really exciting for me to kind of encounter your work at a sort of deeper level and find this very different take. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Who's your supervisor?
My supervisor is Penelope Haralambadal,
okay.
and who I think you know quite well. I think you were sort of contemporaries also. And actually that reminds me, so this is something, because obviously I haven't had the pleasure of getting to know Jonathan Hill, and obviously through his influence on people like Penelope, whose work is really strongly influenced by him. What I can say is that I have a real sense of the loss in the school. It makes me very sad that I didn't get to know him directly as a teacher. But I do feel that influence through people like Penelope.
No, he's a very remarkable person.
So yes, Professor Lokko, architect, academic, novelist, curator. It has been a delight to speak to you.
Yeah, same here.
Especially, as I say again, at such short notice. And I hope there may be another opportunity at some point.
I'm sure there will be. Yeah. Come and see what we're doing in Accra.